All right, guys, thanks for reaching out. And listen, I think he's a great candidate for the online fundamental perfection program. And he looks like a pretty good little athlete. Yeah, I love that you helped me with some information, some extra information. You said he has a tendency of lunging in games. So we're going to talk a little bit about the lunging problem. And, the first thing that I had to learn when I was working with kids is, that's a common cue that we would use on a regular basis. Hey, stay back, stay back. And one of the things, and of course, I guess this isn't true across the board, but typically I think at 12U and below, that cue is almost useless. Because oftentimes the reason why kids are lunging is there's a root problem that we're not addressing, right? So we see the forward movement. We see them, what appears to them going to get the ball, but we don't see why they're doing that in the first place, right? And so as we play this out, right, I want you to see obviously Vladimir Guerrero Jr. on the right here, but you can see that little drifting there that he does. Well, if I use my front hip as the axis of rotation, right, that's going to be a tough spot. So we want to hit against our front hip. And you see when he lands here, and this is the lunging you're pointing out in the first place probably, right? When he lands here and you use the front ball socket as your axis for rotation, there's so many things that can go wrong here, right? My head continues to drift forward. Anybody that's been, if you remember back when you played that and you were early on a ball, you were probably on your front hip, and that's not the most powerful place to hit a ball from. So it's important because you said that he's a contact hitter, and there's probably some of these little things like this could make the difference in, a player going from a contact hitter to more of a gap-to-gap hitter with a little ability to drive the ball just a little bit more. One of the other areas that you see with players that use their front hip or they lunge is this is another area where you hear coaches will say things like, hey, you're pulling your front shoulder out. One of the things I've learned about kids is that if you use, and most kids do, if you use your front hip as the axis for the turn, your front shoulder has no other choice because there's no symmetry in the turn from the front hip. So ultimately our goal when we say stay back to players, it's because we're wanting them to feel if hitting has rotational properties, and it does obviously, right? Then we need a player to have the most symmetrical turn as possible, and so that's why we tell players to stay back. Is not so they'll stay camped out on their back leg, but so that they'll put the core of their weight here between their feet, and we know that there's symmetry. When I'm not turning on top of my front hip socket or my back hip socket, I'm going to have a more symmetrical turn. And also, ultimately, I want to be able to hit against my front hip so I can sit back. And you see how he obviously, Vlad does a pretty good job here, right? So there's a root problem here that has to be addressed, though. We can't just go, all right, this player needs to stay back. You probably said to him over and over again in games, right? Hey, stay back, stay back, stay back. And you still see this. Well, the root problem is something actually, a very sophisticated operation is happening here for your player. And this is what I love about kids. You watch them, you really learn some things about kids. Instead of just watching pro swings in slow motion going, oh, this is the way the swing's supposed to work. If you watch kids closely, you'll learn a lot. Like, for instance, I believe that this lunging characteristic that we see with kids is a compensation mechanism where the brain knows, right, in order to get to this ball on time or to give himself a chance to try to get the barrel out there in time, his brain's saying, well, you know what, your swing back here is a little bit long. Probably don't take the most efficient path. This is the brain talking. He says, all right, so I'm going to start trying to get some weight forward to get the bat to catch up. So this is the root for most kids learning the game. The reason why they lunge is because their body is trying to compensate for the extra length in the swing. So in order to eliminate lunging, I haven't had very much success with this age group saying stay back. Now, older players, obviously, when they understand these fundamental things, as far as being more efficient with their hand path and things like that, that you can talk to those players and get through to them. But kids that have this compensation happening for a reason, you got to remove the length, right? So the other part of the program that's really important, and most people that reach out to me have players that have drag mechanisms, and really it's 95% of kids learning the game have some form of drag. And I've stopped calling and talking about drag as that, because when you hear drag these days, people look at a top hand arm. And what I've learned over the years with kids is this really isn't a top hand arm specific problem. It's certainly a characteristic of players that drag bats. You'll see the top hand arm slotted like this, but you have to go deeper to really understand, well, why do kids do this in the first place? Nobody teaches this pattern of movement. No coaches do, and yet 95% of kids learning the game do this. And what I've learned about this movement is these mechanics are absolutely perfect for what kids think hitting is. So if you jump into a player's brain, you'll probably find that they think hitting is, I've got this big long stick in my hand and I got to move it around as fast as possible. So as far as a round goes, this is perfect biomechanically. The top hand arm slotting like this is probably an advantage. Unfortunately, what happens with this pattern of movement, number one, in a nutshell, players aren't understanding what it means to get inside of the ball. That's the main problem here. But there's a balance problem here that we have to address, okay? And so what's happening here that's important to understand is that his top hand arm is, for right-handed hitters, I know, right? Right-handed hitters typically are right-handed throwers. And we put, as they're learning the game, their right hand dominant arm is the closest thing to the barrel. So the bottom hand, for kids that don't understand lag yet and how they can create energy through the knob of the bat, just a touch, right? Their bottom hand is in a weak spot as far as leveraging the bat. So what they tend to do is they use this arm excessively, the top hand arm, to, number one, create the majority of the energy to start the centripetal force motion, right? So right now, he's trying to start moving the bat around with that arm. Now, the biggest problem with drag, though, okay, is not necessarily just because they try to create all the energy with their top hand arm. I've seen a lot of really good top hand dominant hitters, right? But the problem with this is, people will reach out to me a lot and they'll say, hey, my kid's 9 years old, he's learning the game, and he has drag, and I think that's why he can't hit. And usually that's not really the reason why kids can't hit before the big diamond. That's a whole other story, but I've seen kids have this same pattern of movement that your son has, and they hit balls all over the yard and out of the yard. Now, when drag becomes an issue that we see, and this is why you start seeing these patterns start to kind of go away when kids get to the big diamond, is because a lot of kids get weeded out of the game that have this pattern of movement because they become very frustrated. They used to be a really good hitter at 10U and 11U, things like that, and then suddenly they can't hit anymore. Well, what happened? So when we get to the big diamond, the pitcher on the mound starts growing a little hair in his armpits, maybe a little peach fuzz mustache, right? He's getting bigger and stronger. He's understanding that the goal is to get the batter out, right? Not just to throw balls over the middle of the plate. So he's challenging him with different pitches, different parts of the zone, more velocity. And so where drag becomes a major issue is at that point, because what players that have drag have is, because they're top hand dominant as far as creating energy for the bat, they're also trying to steer the bat with this arm. And steering the bat out of the top of the swing, mainly with the top hand arm, is why we see the sequence problems that people tend to chase with kids that have drag. So for instance, you see Vladimir Guerrero Jr. here with his top hand arm still back as he's going into his landing, and kids always land with it pulled underneath. Well, it's not an advantage to a player that's steering the bat with their top hand arm. It's not a mechanical advantage to have it back. It's actually a disadvantage for his style of hitting. So that's why he pulls it underneath, because he's going to try to start to create the energy with this mechanism, his dominant arm. And the worst problem with this is the bottom hand is not playing a role in delivery. Okay, directionally speaking, that's extremely important. If there's 9 different parts of the zone, right, 9 different parts of the zone, this mechanism, the bottom hand, and the leverage that it's getting, creating and pulling through the bottom of the knob, directionally speaking, is extremely important to understand. Right, so what we're up against here with drag is an energy problem in a nutshell. That's the way I like to address it and look at it. So drag I see as a centripetal force move that the central nervous system for kids creates, because it says, oh, you want to move the bat around really fast? Okay, now what we have to do is we have to take a combination of centripetal force, which is really important, and give players an understanding, directionally speaking, what we're trying to accomplish. And you will not create better direction by focusing on the top hand alone. You have to create understanding of the balance problem by addressing the bottom hand as an energy source down the line. Okay, so what we'll do in the program is, obviously we'll have top hand drills, right? Or maybe a drill for the top hand. But what we're going to do in isolation is we're going to start getting him comfortable with understanding that his weak side mechanism can create energy, not to create a bottom hand dominant hitter, but to create a 50-50 balance. that this arm and hand has as much leverage and pull as far as the direction of the barrel as the top hand arm. If I'm trying, and this is the area right here in this sequence that drives people absolutely crazy. I'm going to kind of move this up a little bit. So you see this state of flexion. This top hand arm is here and it goes through his hand. It's just stuck here, right? And then we see over here with Vlad that what people call this, he's slotting it better or what have you. And there's a lot of drills online where people just try to make the elbow look like this. The worst thing in the world you can do is treat this as an elbow looks wrong problem, right? This is totally and completely an energy problem that has to be addressed that way, because if you don't, you'll miss that this position is not a bent arm position that looks different. What it is his arm is going into a state of extension. Premature extension with the top hand arm, where kids always miss that, because if you're steering the bat with this arm to its destination, you're always going to stay in a state of flexion. This is why most kids that drag, their parents will do a lot of extension drills with them. Well, that'll never fix it. If you don't have the top hand arm feeling like it's along for the ride at some phase of the swing, if it's always steering, then we're in trouble, right? And this is the main difference between players out of the top of the swing. When you see players like this, where Vlad is going this direction, right, and the top hand arm stays back, is because his top hand arm is not steering the bat to its destination here. Your player is doing that 100%, all top hand. So we're going to go through a balancing act in the program. We're going to try to get him to trust. We're going to get his central nervous system that trusts that, hey, only the top hand can do all the work here. We're going to try to get him to understand there's a balance here, a 50-50 balance. And so we're going to take him from his excessive drag swing and start introducing lag. We're giving the barrel a source of energy to chase, right, that we can ultimately throw into centripetal force. But I'm not going to start with centripetal force first. I've got to give some direction at some point in this phase of the swing. Okay, and so as far as the top hand arm goes, I want you to think about this. Like, let's say we took the bat out of his hand and we just got his top hand back like he's going to throw a punch. And we caught on video him throwing a punch. Now, I don't think the top hand arm movement on the bat is the same as a punch. I'm just using that as how the anatomy works. So if we threw a punch in slow motion, you'd see at the start of the punch, his arm would be in a state of flexion back here, right? Just like Vlad, right? Just like this. And then he starts to punch. And we'd see in the first few frames of the punch that his arm is still in a state of flexion, right? And then we played a little forward when we see that his arm was still in a state of flexion. Maybe it starts to extend, and then there's a point where we say, now the punch is extending. This is how we look at hitting sometimes. And the reality is, for anybody that's ever thrown a punch, right, the feeling has nothing to do with flexion, except for the start of the punch. Everything after the start of the punch feels like extension. And kids don't feel that because they're steering with that arm, right? I don't know if any of that made sense to you. But that's what we're going to start trying to balance out. Okay, we will cure by doing dynamic balance reps, him having a better understanding of where his weight's going to be as well. We're going to cure a little bit of this energy problem that we're seeing here. We also try to challenge players to create more extension and range of motion down the line. I have to understand what it means to hit through space. So I don't work on extension drills. I work on the real problem. The real problem is players don't understand the range of motion. This is why you see his finish going low and flat. The lower and flatter I'm going here, the more I'm going around the most important phase of the swing. So in order to create more extension through the zone, I have to feel what it means to stay through. And so we go through space and we finish through space, right? Kids usually are going around their body and around their back shoulder or front shoulder at some point in this transition, right? So we're going to give him more awareness on what his body's going to feel. We're also going to keep him on the ball a little bit better. His front shoulder, again, coming off the ball there is because of him standing on his front hip. All right, so I recommend the player bundle. Right, that's the access point where you can work directly with me. Right, I want to share with you while we're working together my experience, right, to help you and your player. Right, and one of the things about player access, and a lot of people buy that. I don't really see a whole big advantage to that. There's a bunch of drills. There's a lot of drills on YouTube, and we try to give troubleshooting information and stuff like that. But the real advantage is working with somebody that's done these drills for years and understands kids. And we'll be able to do that through collaboration in the player bundle. I appreciate you guys reaching out. Thanks.